Dear colleagues, so we've already seen how two dictators, in particular Franco and Mussolini, used football for their own ends. And you may be thinking at this point, well, these people are extremely powerful. I mean, that's the whole idea behind a dictator, right? I mean, these people have the army, they have public services, the economy, the government at their fingertips. Why would they even bother about a sport, of all things, a game? Why would they care about a harmless sport that involves kicking a bit of rubber or whatever footballs are made of into a mesh net? I mean, why would they care about that? Well, Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco all were heavily invested in football and the fates of their favourite teams. And they used football, as we saw in the previous speech. And this truly is the ugly side of the so-called beautiful game. Now, we know that football can bring people together from different communities, backgrounds, and beliefs. We know that it brings people together through the love of the sport itself and through the culture that it spawns. But at the same time, football and the history of football is indissociable from a history of rivalry and opposition. But why is football so closely tied to dictatorial regimes? Well, I'm going to attempt to break this down into a few key points. First of all, football is the most popular sport on earth. Let's admit it. And it's popular in the fullest sense of the term. You don't need to be rich. You don't need to have any social standing at all to enjoy football, to play it, or to watch it. And dictators have always seen football as a way of consolidating their popularity and showing that they identified with real people, with ordinary people. It was a way of showing their support for the masses. It was a way of galvanizing support. It was a way of accessing the largest possible support base. And fascism often uses populism to appeal to the masses. So I also mean popular in other ways as well, because we've all seen grown men cry over their favorite football team losing. And we've all seen people experience and show that ultimate elation and ecstasy when their team wins. And I think the hope for many fascist regimes in history has been that the elation that these people feel and have felt when seeing their team win would then be transferred to the regime. For example, Goebbels, one of Hitler's right-hand men, once claimed that the Germans would rather see their favorite football team win than see the Nazi army conquer another piece of land, for example. And I think that really is very telling. But in the case of Mussolini, what he did was he professionalized football in Italy. He put an end to the fragmentation and the disjointed administration. And he, in many ways, led the Italian team to victory at the time. He got people to unite behind a national team. And the idea was that if he could get people to unite behind this national team, he could then get people to unite behind him and attribute the victory of the team to him and his regime. And a very similar philosophy could be noted in the fascist dictatorships of Uruguay and Argentina and Brazil. So when I say that football is the most popular sport on earth, I mean it's popular because people have a fierce love of it, a fervent and visceral love of the game. But also it's a sport which breaks down social barriers, and it enables dictators or even people of other political views to galvanize the biggest possible social and electoral base. But there's another reason why there are these really tight links between football and dictatorships, is because of the inherently national and nationalistic nature of football. Think about it. With football, you have national teams fighting each other, or basically fighting each other. They're playing against each other, but in many ways, they are fighting against each other, if you like. You have country pitted against country. And I think what all of these dictatorships that I've mentioned have in common is the belief in national superiority. It's the belief in nationalism. It's a rejection of other countries and cultures. It's a belief in a so-called national purity. And obviously, in the case of football, your rival is in many cases, in the case of international football, your rival is another country, and that obviously is going to stoke some sort of patriotic, if not nationalistic, sentiment, or even resentment as well. So this is why football has often been used by fascist dictators to stoke that nationalistic pride and honor. Pride and honor are inherent in any sport. Victory is seen as synonymous of honor. Failure is seen as synonymous of dishonor. And obviously the stakes get much higher when you're talking about international sport. So I think there's that element to it as well. But then there's also, I think, the military nature of football. And of course, the military has been a very important part of fascist dictatorships down through history. It was a really important part of Mussolini's regime, Hitler's regime, Franco's regime, etc. And as we saw rather in the previous speech with the Italian national team during Mussolini's regime, it's very easy to implement military style discipline in the case of a sports team, and in particular a football team. If you think about it, you have the coaching, you have the training, you have the emphasis on toning your physique, physical conditioning. All of these are elements which we see in the army in many ways. During Mussolini's regime, there was actually not that much difference between the training required to join the Italian national army and the training required to join the Italian national football team. But that's also the case with many other countries and fascist dictatorships and armies as well. So the physical conditioning is really important, and the discipline, the idea of obedience, obeying a higher command, that these are all aspects which we see in the military, but also in football teams as well. And finally, there's the inherently combative nature of football. If you think about it, football games are almost like a mini war. They're a mini war complete with flags and uniforms and emblems and supporters on each side and visceral rivalry. So there's something really inherent. There's something inherently combative, I think, about football. And you even have ammunition in the shape of a small rubber ball, if you think about it. And think for a moment about the language used when talking about football. You have words like shoot, or defense, or striker, or attacking the ball. These are all words and terms which come up regularly in the football domain. I remember once talking to an ultra, a so-called football ultra from Pisa in Italy, and he was telling me that he was a proud Pisan and that he went to all of the matches that Pisa played against Florence. And I asked him about his love of the game itself, and he said, "Oh no, I don't really go to the matches to watch football. I just go to fight. I really like fighting Florentines." Who knew? But I think it is very telling about the inherently combative nature of football. However, I've talked so much about the ugly side of football, but actually football can be used to resist dictatorships as well. There is also a beautiful side to football as well. In my first speech, I talked a lot about how Barcelona FC was used as a team to showcase Catalan culture and the Catalan culture and Catalan language, which was so repressed at that time. And actually, as I said, the Barcelona Football Club was one of the very few places where Catalan was still spoken, despite the crackdowns on Catalan speakers. But there's another example, a really telling example, and that's the example of a Portuguese team. Actually, it is thought that football was one of the catalysts for the demise of the Salazar fascist regime in 1969. There was a football club at the time which, by dint of its amazing acts of bravery, gave the country the confidence to bring down the dictatorship. So in the 1960s, the Portuguese national team was really at its peak. The Portuguese team had started to recruit from its African colonies, and that had really led to the success of the national team and of the Lisbon team, Benfica. In 1966, Portugal actually finished third in the World Cup in England, which was actually a disappointing result for Portugal because they were the favourites at the time. But there was so much discontent in society in general in Portugal. There was discontent with the colonial wars, and there were many protests going on at the time. And the dissent was palpable, particularly in the universities, and in particular in the oldest and most prestigious University of Coimbra. In 1962, the wars against the African colonies actually led to really significant uprisings and rebellions. Students were often drafted into the army against their will, and they were forced to go and fight in the context of these colonial wars in Africa. And this led to many protests at Coimbra University. The students were obviously furious at being used as essentially cannon fodder in Africa in the context of a war which they profoundly disagreed with anyway. But Coimbra's local football club is called Academica de Coimbra. And actually at the time students could play, they could join the team, and many did. Many came from the African colonies, as I said. Many even had connections with military resistance groups. And they joined the football club as a form of resistance, and I'll now explain why. In 1969, Academica de Coimbra made it to the final of the Portuguese Cup, so the equivalent of the Premier League in England, for example. And the final gave the students a really significant platform for their views. Throughout the tournament, the players at Academica had demonstrated solidarity for the students who had been drafted into the army by observing 30 seconds of silence before each game. And actually in the semi-finals, they switched from their traditional all-black kit to a white kit with a black armband in order to symbolize mourning for their dead friends, those friends of theirs who had been forcibly drafted into the army and then killed during the wars in Africa. But then on the day of the final, they were playing against Benfica, and more than 30,000 students from Coimbra and Lisbon turned up. They descended on the streets of the capital to support the Academica team. They held banners and shouted slogans against the regime. Of course, the regime refused to broadcast the match, but the students kept on going anyway. They kept on handing out flyers, shouting slogans against the regime, and in general, just resisting the fascist regime. The Academica players then entered the pitch wearing their black students' gowns in order to show solidarity with the students. What's interesting is actually many of the Benfica players actually supported the cause, and they agreed that if Academica should win, Benfica would then celebrate with them because it would be a victory for them as well, because they also supported that cause. In the end, Benfica won. They scored a goal in extra time. But the Benfica players at the end of the match swapped shirts with the Academica players, and they went up to collect the trophy dressed in the black Academica shirt as a sign of respect for the students, which obviously is a really lovely and significant gesture. So Academica may have lost, but they gained a lot of respect and attention for the students' cause. And actually they sacrificed their own careers as well, because none of the Academica side were then selected for the national team. Many of them actually then became leaders of the 1974 Carnation revolution, which then obviously toppled Salazar's fascist regime. So actually, it may have been exaggerated of me to say that this match brought down Salazar's dictatorship, but it is a really good example of sport, and particularly football, kicking back at a brutal dictatorship. Because after all, sport, I think, can bring out the best and worst in people. Sport, I don't think, is inherently noble, but nor is it inherently depraved. I think it can be used for good and bad in equal measure. Sport can bring people together, or it can be a tool of nationalistic exclusion. But sport, I think, is what we make of it. Sport is, I think, a blank canvas. And depending on whether the human race inspires you with more confidence or despair and distrust, you can then conclude that this blank canvas is fated to be a repulsive stain or a beautiful painting. Thank you for your attention.